This video is going to deal with the nervous system. We're going to have a look at how the nervous system is organized, the cells that are found in the nervous system, and how those different types of nerve cells work together to coordinate actions like reflexes to keep our body safe. Now, the main organizational structure of the nervous system composes of two main parts. We have the central nervous system, also known as the CNS, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the type of nerve cells involved there are called relay neurons. Sometimes you see them called interneurons. Now, the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of the central nervous system, so it includes things like the cranial nerves, which are here, the spinal nerves, which come out from the spine here, and the peripheral nerves, which are found in your periphery, so in your arms and in your legs. And this contains the nerve cells called sensory neurons and motor neurons. And just like CNS stands for central nervous system, we have PNS for peripheral nervous system. So when we look at reacting to a stimulus, so here is a stimulus, there's a glass of water here, I can see it with my photoreceptors in my eyes. What do I do with that information? Well, the information is turned into an electrical signal which travels along my sensory neuron, and it can do two things. I can think about it in my brain, make a decision to pick it up, and then my motor neuron will trigger my muscle to actually move the water towards my mouth. But I could see the glass of water, my sensory neuron has a reflex action, and only my spinal cord is involved. I don't really think about it at all. This is an involuntary rapid reaction, and my arm immediately picks it up. Now, that doesn't usually happen with a glass of water, but it might happen if I pricked my finger with a pin or if I touched something hot. Now, if we think back to the previous slide, we had two different parts of the nervous system. So in this diagram, over here we have the central nervous system, so that's the brain and the spinal cord, and then we have the peripheral nervous system. It's happening here with the sensory neuron, and the peripheral nervous system where the information comes from the brain and travels to the muscles in the motor neuron. So let's have a look at those nerve cells in more detail. So the first one was the sensory neuron. This was going from the photoreceptor in the eye, so you could pick up some information from the photoreceptors in the eye. It could be a different type of receptor, but you can see that the nerve cell, the neuron, is actually quite complex. So we have dendrites at one end. These are very thin little projections that contact the receptor. They then send the electrical signal down an axon, which is a really thin piece of the cell, which travels all the way to the other end of the cell and ends in axon terminals, and these are going to talk to the brain. So central nervous system and the brain will get information from these axons, and then they'll make a decision what to do next. So all of this brown is one cell. So cell membrane on the outside, and one cell. Here is the nucleus, so all cells have a nucleus, and this is sort of cytoplasm in here in the cell body, and a really thin axon. There are actually some extra cells on this picture. These are called Schwann cells, and you can see them here, and they wrap themselves around the axon, and that's really important for making the nerve's message, the electrical signal, travel very quickly along the nerve axon. So the nerve is carrying a message from left to right, and it's an electrical signal. Let's see where it goes next. So it goes now into the central nervous system, and it's going to pass on its information to a relay neuron, and you can see at the top here that it's sometimes also called an interneuron. So these only exist in the central nervous system, in the brain and in the spinal cord. The information has come up the top end here from the sensory neuron, so that it comes in here, the electrical signal, and the impulse, the electrical signal that's now generated in this nerve cell, travels from top to bottom and moves out of these endings down here, down at the bottom. So these endings are now going to pass the message on to the next part of the system. So we've got to now speak to the muscles. So let's have a look what happens next. Here is a motor neuron. This is our motor neuron. And the labels are open for you to write in yourself. So you can pause this video and have a little guess of what the labels are. And then when you're ready, you can join me again. So we've got dendrites up here. We have the cell membrane around the edge of the cell. This time the nerve cell is purple. We have the axon, that's the thin bit of the nerve cell. We have the nerve endings down this end. They're going to contact the muscle. We have the nucleus of the cell up the top here by the dendrites. And we also have surrounding the purple cell, which is the motor neuron, we have these additional cells called Schwann cells that are going to help the nerve electrical signal travel really quickly down the motor neuron. So there's a Schwann cell and a nucleus of the next Schwann cell next to it. So we are picking up information from the central nervous system here, and we are sending it to muscles down the end here, or maybe to a gland. A hormone might be released from a gland, or sweat might be released from a sweat gland, but the direction of travel is from the dendrites all the way down to the nerve endings. So if we look at those three cells joined together in a response, here is our sensory neuron at the top here. So that's this cell here. And then we have our interneuron or relay neuron. That's the cell in the middle. There. And then we have our last nerve cell or neuron, which is our motor neuron. And you can see that it is very closely in contact with the or the relay neuron, and it has a long axon that connects it to this down here, which is the muscle. And this whole system of these three cells together is called a reflex arc, and it triggers a reflex action. So when we receive information in the form of a stimulus, like for example touching a hot plate, we will then send the information all the way to an effector, and that effector might be a muscle, like it is in this case, or it might be a gland, so a hormone producing or a sweat producing gland. Now you'll notice though the nerves don't actually touch each other perfectly. There is a tiny, tiny gap, and that's called a synapse. And this picture here shows how synapses work. You have vesicles, which are little bubbles containing chemicals. They bind to the end of one nerve cell, neuron, and they release their chemicals into the gap when they're triggered to by the message coming down the axon. And then the chemical travels across the gap and causes the next nerve cell to trigger its electrical signal and pass it on. It's really important to have a gap in the process so that we have some control and we can override any reflex actions if we need to. And here's a table of different sorts of reflex actions that exist. Everything from our eyes responding to bright light. So bright light or dim light, our pupils will change size, all the way through to why we sneeze. So particles might touch our nose and our diaphragm rapidly contracts. And these are all examples of reflexes.